The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for showing up today. My name is Randy Robb, and I'm a senior architect here at Oxford Computer Group. And today we're going to talk about building a secure and scalable Azure AD B2C implementation for education organizations. That sounds like a mouthful, but it's not super technical. Sometimes I have very technical presentations, but I don't think this one is too technical. The overall goal, though, today is just to show you some of our experience in integrating B2C with our educational clients that we have. So if I can figure out how to advance my slide, we'll go here. Here's our sales slide. So if you want to read this, you can find out everything about Oxford Computer Group. We're very skilled in a lot of Azure services, identity, Azure applications. One of the things that I think is most important here is that for 2020, we were the finalists for the Microsoft Security System Integrator of the Year. And we do work a lot with the cloud engineering team. My own specialization is in identity management, and I have a developer background, so I know all about modern Auth, integrating modern applications with Azure, OpenID Connect, OAuth, things like that at a very deep technical level, as well as how that relates to identity and authentication and authorization. So that's my background, that's OCG's background. And today's agenda, that's pretty much in 3 sections. First, I'm going to show you what we see as far as the authentication and authorization environments that we see with most of our clients, how and why we integrate Azure AD B2C into those environments, and some of the benefits of integrating with B2C, and some of the things that we've done to assist clients in integrating B2C with their solutions. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and type that in the question box and I'll answer them at the end of each section. So when we're looking at the educational space, K through 12 and higher ed, we usually see these 3 types of user types. We have staff and teachers. They're the ones that give the assignments and pretty much manage the students. Then you have the students that need to get the assignments and complete the assignments. And then you have this other section of users that are typically required. Almost always you have some parents or caregivers or somebody that's responsible in higher ed. You have the parents or other people that are responsible for financial aid or things like that that need to get access to the student data. Those students are adults, so there's only so much you can do, but there are situations where you have to expose data to other individuals. And so here we're going to talk about some of the scenarios, how organizations implement authentication and authorization in their environment. So we're talking about, typically you have the student information systems as the application. And in all applications, the user needs to access data. So the application is really what mediates the control between the end user and the application and the data in the application, or the data that the application exposes. The data is actually in some kind of database somewhere or some other storage media, and the application actually controls what gets to the end user. And what I want to point out in this slide is that the applications, whatever application you have, that ultimately controls access and controls authorization. You can put your authentication, or you can put the application into another type of secure platform, like maybe you're integrating with Azure AD, or maybe you're integrating it with LDAP, or whatever you're integrating that with. Ultimately, the person that writes the application and the controls within that application controls the authorization. And usually within the application, you have different levels like reader, read writer, administrator, or whatever. It's like a SQL database. You have roles within the SQL database and within those tables. Well, that is part of the application control, and that is the ultimate control for access to that data. So part of that, if you just have an application and in its own control plane, then you have to have authentication, because although a user can be authorized to get that data, you have to know who that user is. So there has to be authentication there somewhere. And if you don't put it into something like Azure AD or another environment like that, the application needs to control authentication. And usually it's a database table or with the user ID and passwords that are encrypted. Maybe it's hashed somehow, but that's on the application side within the application data, if it's up to the applications to control authentication. And if we look at the history of this, if it's a single application and you don't have any other control planes, then whether it's an on-premises application or a cloud-based application, like I said, they control authentication and authorization. But in the past, it was shown, hey, why are we doing this authentication? Let's offload it someplace else, because maybe the environment you want single sign-on or whatever, and this is a long time ago in the past. You used to have on-premises applications, and they would say, okay, well, let's integrate it with Active Directory. So these student information systems and other applications as well would integrate with AD, and you could either trust the AD environment or trust the LDAP or trust an LDAP server. We used to see those things all the time. And usually these are all on premises. And so what ultimately happens is that authentication is handled by that security plane of the directory, and then authorization then is based, like I said, within the application itself. Well, as time went on, there were standardized protocols that were being developed, and one of these was SAML. So of course, Microsoft built a federation server that they could put on top of AD or LDAP. You can also integrate that with an LDAP server. But basically, this was a way to create SAML integrations with other applications. So applications could offload their authentication to the ADFS system. And so the user would authenticate via ADFS or through the federation server. And that's where the authentication would come from. Authorization, again, would end up in those applications. As time progressed, and this is what we see now in most of these integrations, is that you have an Azure AD environment. And usually, because these are older systems, educational institutions have been using these student information systems for a long time. So maybe they used to integrate with AD, all their users or staff, their teachers are still on AD. Basically, they use Azure AD Connect to grab these identities and push them up to Azure AD. And of course, Azure AD not only does federation with SAML, but it can also do OpenID Connect as well. In fact, the whole thing, the whole Azure environment is an OAuth, OIDC environment, along with SAML integration as well. So this is where we see most of the students and teachers and integrating with their student information systems is in this type of environment. And the staff, because they're in an Azure environment, they usually have Azure services or Azure applications that they also deliver to their students and staff. And that's like Exchange, Outlook, SharePoint. They use OneDrive to share class data, and some of these software information systems can integrate with that pretty well, so that you can have assignments and secure those assignments via OneDrive. The teachers can get the information from OneDrive, and everything works fine with that. And so that is the staff and teachers type of user types. And you ask, okay, well, this all works fine. Well, where does B2C come into play? And that is because parents and caregivers, as well as higher ed to certain data, they don't need Exchange, they don't need SharePoint, they don't need any of the other applications that Azure provides. All they need to do is get to the application data. And there are different legal requirements, there are different conditional access policies for parents. So it's a different, it should be a different security plane, and that's how we implement it, as a completely different security plane for accessing that data. So that's where B2C comes in. And since I'm going to transition into a new section now, I don't know if anybody has any questions. I don't see any typed in right now. So I'm going to go on to the next section. So how do we integrate B2C, Azure AD B2C, into this type of environment? Well, it depends on the student information system or the application that you're trying to integrate with. In some applications, you can have dual SAML providers. In some applications, you have a single SAML. You can only have a single SAML provider. So in this situation here, I'm going to show you how we integrate with applications that can recognize dual SAML configurations. So basically what you do, there is one already in place for the student and teachers in Azure AD. And so what we do is we go into the application and we have to trust another identity provider. So we set up Azure AD B2C to be that other identity provider. And so once you do that, if it's a dual SAML environment, this is what it looks like from a service provider point of view. And SAML integrations, there's SP initiated, which is service provider initiated, or you can have identity provider initiated access to these applications. And so what that means is just that you either go to the application side first and let the application redirect you to the identity provider, or you go to the identity provider first and let the identity provider direct you to some type of application endpoint. So right here, I'm showing you what the service provider initiated response would be. So here you see, because we have two SAML environments, we have two buttons here. So if you were to choose the first button there, you would be sent back to what you were traditionally would do, which would be the Azure AD environment. That's where the students and staff would authenticate. But pushing that other button, the parents, caregivers would redirect you to B2C, and you'd see something like this. So this is where the parents and caregivers would log in. They'd see the screen, they log in, then they'd be redirected to the application. And because they were given a read-only role or a parent role in that other application, they'd only be able to see their own students or their own data that they had access to. In the situation where you have a single SAML environment, we can also do the same thing, but in that situation, there'll be only a single identity provider, and that identity provider will actually be Azure AD B2C. But that doesn't mean that the identities need to be stored in Azure AD B2C, because you can trust other identity providers. And in that situation, you create the environment on B2C to trust the Azure AD environment where the students and teachers would be at. And if you go to the service provider initiated screen here, you just have to put in your school, or you'd have a custom link that the school would put a link on, and that link would have the school name in it. I'm just showing you this because this is one of the examples of how you do that. You put in your school, and then you'd be redirected to the identity provider. And remember, the identity provider can only be one, so you're going to be redirected to B2C. And so B2C would be the landing page for all authentication in your environment. So you could log in with your student and staff identity, which would then redirect you back to Azure AD, and then redirect you to the application. Or you'd log in as a parent and caregiver, and then once you authenticate, then you'd go back to the application. And because it's a single trusted source, again, you would only be given access to the data that you were set up roles for within the application. Is there any questions about that discussion? If not, I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of B2C integration. What kinds of things can we do once we integrate with B2C? Well, here's one example. The parent or caregiver or the responsible party account requires account creation in the student information system application. But they also need some type of vetting. So I know a lot of situations where we've implemented this. The old way of doing things is you have to submit some kind of form, and then they have to create the parent account on the back-end system, and then they have to send something special to the parent to say, hey, okay, we've created your account, now go and do whatever. There's a lot of complicated paperwork that needs to be done. So how do we solve this with B2C? So here's an example of a client that does this, that we've helped implement this with. So basically, the parent pre-registers an email address and they designate what student they are a caregiver of, or somehow they align themselves with the student with this. And so they'll be sent a letter with a unique registration key along with that pre-registered email address that they gave their data to the school. And so the parent would then go to the B2C to create their account, they create an email, they enter their email and password, and then they have to enter their unique key. Well, that unique key has to match the email that they previously registered. And so once on the first registration, what will happen is B2C will actually utilize the application's API to create that account, and then they can authenticate. You have to remember that in these SAML apps or any of these applications, the user data, the user that's trying to gain access to the data, their identity, even though it's authenticated on an external system, the actual record, the user record for that user and their role has to be created within the application, within the database of the application before they can gain access, because there has to be an associated account on both sides, not only on the identity side, but also on the application side. So this will do this automatically for them without having to have some admin create that account on the back end for them. What else can we do? Well, not only can it create one account, but it can create multiple accounts on multiple applications. So let's say that you not only had a student information systems application account where there's a parent, but you also wanted to add them to a busing application or add them to a financial aid application or whatever other applications you had in your environment. Well, once they register, depending on the type that they are, maybe you want to create in more than one system at that initial creation. And that's another thing that you could do within B2C, within these custom policies. That way you don't have to have multiple creations of multiple accounts manually in the system. It can all be automated. One thing I want to mention too, with the vetting is this is one example of doing that, but there may be more to the vetting of the parent. Maybe because B2C is completely customizable, you can also create any type of algorithm or procedure that you want. Maybe you want them to create the account and then send it, and then the process will send an email to another administrator and they'll confirm everything. And maybe it'll be multiple confirmations if you need that, depending on how secure you want that to be. That's all doable within B2C. This is just a very simple example that we've helped school implement. What else can you do with B2C? Well, if you use Azure's API management service, you can do some pretty fancy things to ease the load on the application APIs. A lot of these APIs are not very robust. I know I worked with a few clients that even the vendor had created their own API into the student information system application, and it was not a very well written API. So it would time out a lot. It would be overloaded by a lot of demand, and it was didn't really give a very good feedback to the end user that was trying to use it as to what was going on. So using the API management service, you can do some things that'll return some friendly errors, create throttling with that, and you could also do token caching. And the reason that you'd want to do that is some of these APIs that they write need a bearer token in order to get access and do some of the things on the backend API. Well, when you do that, every time you make a call, you have to get that access token, unless you cache it somehow, and the API management service will allow you to do that. When you use the Azure API management service, you get, this is kind of one of the screens. I have an API here that I have integrated with that, a test API. And basically what you do is you write these policies. They're simple XML policies, and it's not very difficult really to write these. But you can do things like I'm going to show you here what some of the code looks like. You can rate limit, you can set the backend service, you can also do outbound error processing, you can send customized error messages to the backend. And basically what this does is it sits between your API, your application API, and B2C. So this is the intermediary part of this. It does a lot of, you can do preloading, you can do post-loading, and you can do some things that if you want to apply policies to the back end as well, you can. So here's an example of a throttling policy. So here is one that I've got in a test environment. I've got a rate limit to 2, and the renewal period is 30 seconds. So in this situation, this is just for testing. If there's more than 2 calls to the API in 30 seconds, then it's going to get a 409 error sent back to B2C saying, hey, we're experiencing a large amount of traffic. Please try again in 30 seconds. So depending on how robust your backend API is, you can control those limiting calls and the renewal period to try to ease up on when the time comes when all these parents are registering. Well, you can put some of this into place so they know what's going on, because sometimes these APIs will just go off into la la land and you don't know. The thing will just keep spinning and spinning and spinning, and there's no feedback. So this helps provide that feedback. And this looks a little bit more complex, but basically what this is doing is it's getting that bearer token using OAuth so they can talk to that backend API. And then what it does is stores this into a cache, into the API cache. So what will happen is that this one in particular is, well, it's looking at the token expiration time, but typically those tokens should last an hour. So what we do is have this set up and get a new token. It was a little bit less than an hour, then we get a new token. And that way, maybe you have 1,000 calls. Now you're not getting 1,000 tokens. You're only getting a token at the first time, and it's sharing that token because it's good for 60 minutes. And then once that 60 minutes is up, every time a request is done, it checks, oh, is it time to get a new token? Time to get a new token? Oh, it is. And so it'll grab a new token. So now, even though you've got 1,000 requests, it's only getting 1 token per hour. So that really reduces the stress on these APIs. There's another solution that we've implemented for clients, is that they want to move to modern auth, and maybe they have an application that will give them modern auth, so they want to use SAML, but they also have an old system that is a legacy system, and the username and password is actually on that old system. And so one thing they can do is to, okay, one application uses the old way where it has its ID and password, and then new one, just basically create a new identity and have them log in with 2 different IDs. Well, that's going to be confusing to the parents, and they didn't want to do that. So what we can do with B2C is utilize the old user ID and password in order to authenticate. So those identities that are in the legacy application are preloaded into the new application, so the identities match. And so since it's uploading authentication to Azure AD B2C, when the person enters their ID and password, well, all they have to do is remember one ID. And so what Azure AD B2C will do is talk to the backend API to look at the legacy authentication. So when the person puts in their password, it'll actually be checked against the legacy application. And if the legacy application is okay with that password, then it'll let them into the new modern application that accepts SAML or OIDC. There wouldn't be a single application interface for this, because the legacy application still requires an ID and password, but you can still utilize that authentication across all your modern apps, so the parent won't have to remember different ID and password for modern versus legacy application. So we've done that. The other thing that we've helped implement is Dynamics Fraud Protection. Dynamics Fraud Protection is really good because although you have the ability within B2C to do conditional access and account health on local accounts within Azure AD B2C, you can have a P2 license and apply those to local accounts. That doesn't really apply to social accounts. Well, if you want the same level of identity health and protection against bots and protection against, maybe you don't want other countries trying to get into your and hack into your student information system, then there are rules that can be created in Dynamics Fraud Protection that can secure those accounts, not only local accounts, but secure accounts. And one of the things that you can do with Dynamics Fraud Protection as well is create a hardware signature. So whether you're coming in, it'll recognize a common phone, a common computer that you use, or whatever. A unique signature is developed every time you log in. So you can have special rules to say, okay, well, has this user authenticated with this other device before? Maybe you want them to put them into a different risk score. Well, then you can do things like maybe force MFA on that user if you want to. And that's how Dynamics Fraud Protection works. There's a risk score based on a lot of metrics that you can consume, where the user is coming from, how often the user's logged in the past, how quickly they logged in. There's a lot of AI integrated with Dynamics Fraud Protection. It's really good. It's a really neat API that you can integrate with. And the way this integrates with B2C is it actually ties in with authentication. So as part of your authentication custom policy, you forward that to the Dynamics Fraud Protection API. And then once you authenticate, it's redirected back to Azure AD B2C. It kind of intercepts that whole authentication process and confirms it. It doesn't store passwords or anything like that, but it does interface with that whole authentication protocol. And so what else can we do with B2C? Well, we have all the standard stuff that we provide to our clients who utilize B2C, self-service password reset for the local accounts, the ability to integrate with external identity providers. Any SAML or OpenID Connect or OAuth identity provider can be integrated with B2C. I've seen clients integrate the Microsoft accounts, Facebook, Google, Twitter. Those are the main ones I see clients integrating with. The other thing that you can do is, because you've got a single source of authentication for the parents, and you do have an identity database that's part of B2C, you can utilize that to create a single point of auditing for compliance. So you can add custom attributes. You can add the last login time. You can add when they were disabled, when they were enabled, when the account was created. So if you have any type of compliance requirements that are based on the parent, that can actually be part of the B2C metrics that you consume. And it creates basically a parent profile or a responsible party profile, so that you can see everything that that identity has access to and the history of that. Along with that is reporting metrics as far as error reporting and load, and what types of policies you're applying to your B2C users. That's all available in reporting as well. And if you want to keep track of their phone numbers, their address or whatever, there is the ability to provide self-edit profiles for them, so that you can integrate with parents in that way too, and caregivers and responsible parties. MFA is important because you can provide that level of security with B2C, not only for local accounts, but social accounts as well. You can integrate MFA. Basically, once they authenticate, you can force them to MFA based on a secure phone number that you collect from them at the initial sign-on. So that's another very important thing for security that you can provide for your end users. The other two things is that the logon screen, as well as any self-asserted profiles, the imaging of that, the visualization of that is completely customizable. So you can put your own logos, your own GIFs, whatever you want to put on there. It's all customizable. You can put the buttons where you want them. You can put the logins where you want them. It's entirely, the end user experience is customizable. And when I say completely customizable in the last sentence, that means that this B2C provides SAML, OpenID Connect, and OAuth integration. That's a modern authentication authorization protocol. And as part of that, your application that you have trusts B2C for authentication. And in order for authentication and authorization, because really authentication is being provided by B2C, but part of that is the authorization to that platform as well. Even though you're not authorized to the point of, hey, you're not being authorized at the role level necessarily like the application gives you, you are authorized whether you have access to that application or not. And the authorization can be anything you want to within B2C. And nobody has ever done this, but if you even wanted to, you could have B2C interface with a device that would create a snail mail, have it be sent off, and have a receipt with that snail mail, put it into some other conversion routine, put a signal in, and then say, okay, this person is authorized, right? You can do anything you want to with B2C with that authorization flow. And that's a great thing about B2C, is that it's completely customizable to do whatever you want it to do. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation, guys. If you have any questions, please type them in. I'll wait a few minutes for questions. No questions. Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening, and Here's some, if you want to send us an email, go ahead and we can answer your emails. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.